Good evening and welcome to Antarctica Insight Live 2024. My name is Camilla Nichol and I'm the Chief Executive of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust, and I'm delighted you're able to join us this evening. Thank you very much for tuning in. So if you're new to Antarctica Insight Live, then welcome. But this is our programme of webinars where we explore Antarctica a bit more deeply, bringing experts together to get under the skin of all aspects of Antarctica, its wildlife and landscape, its history and the people who have made it. So I hope we're able to bring new perspectives and real experiences to provide insights into this endlessly fascinating place. We have quite a back catalogue, so if you are interested in the stories we've been telling so far, you can listen back to the previous events on our YouTube channel. We'll have links to that from our website, and we'll put some links in the chat for you as well. The Antarctic season, it's November, December, so the Antarctic season is well underway, and our team have landed at Port Lockroy and the work there has begun. And later on this season, our conservation team will be heading to the remote Blaiklock Island, which is right down in the southern part of the peninsula, to carry out conservation works on our smallest historic site, Blaiklock Refuge. And this is a site very small, very important, and played a vital role in supporting sledging teams who travelled all over the peninsula with dog teams, surveying and mapping the landscape. And so it's a site that's very much associated with tonight's topic. The reason I'm telling you this, of course, is this crucial work to protect this site for the future is only possible with your help. And I tell this because today is Giving Tuesday, and with that we are launching our Christmas fundraising campaign appeal to raise £35,000 to support this project at Blaiklock. For the conservation work this season. So we've partnered with the Big Give, which means that every donation made this week will be matched. So you can every donation will be doubled. So every £1 you give will become £2. So right up from today until the 10th of December. The link is on screen, and we'll also share a link in the chat as well. But every £1 helps. And this week, every £1 becomes £2. So thank you in advance for your support. So please, if you can, please do support our appeal. Thank you. So on to tonight. So a topic we've often been asked to talk about is dogs in the Antarctic. And I can't believe we've held off this long. Dogs have played an important role in Antarctica since humans began exploring it. And I think much is owed to the humble dog in their contribution to our understanding of the continent and indeed the survival of many people over the last century or so. So I think they've played a vital role. So tonight I have with me an expert hand in dog driving in Antarctica who will share with us some insights into the extraordinary contribution dogs have made to our shared history in Antarctica. So I'm delighted to introduce Nick Cox, who's had a remarkable career with the British Antarctic Survey. He's a boatman, field guide, base commander, and crucially for tonight, dog driver. And a career that has earned him both a Polar Medal and a second class for that medal. So a very warm welcome to you tonight, Nick.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me along.
It's great to have you with us. So together, I think we're going to explore all things dog in Antarctica. And I'm pleased to say, everybody, Nick is very happy to take your questions. So please post any questions you might have in the comments, and we'll put as many to you, Nick, as we have time for. So, Nick, I'm going to explore with you first, I think, just a little bit about you. So tell me about your career journey. What took you to Antarctica and why dogs?
I think, like a lot of people, something dropped into the head, very early days. And for me, it was about the age of 6. My dear parents gave me a book, the Puffin Picture Book of Polar Exploration. I can hardly say it. And then followed that by school, where one of the masters, John Bull, had been at Signey Island and Anvers Island and drove dogs quite extensively there in, I think it was 55 to 57. And then, of course, the TAE expedition film and so on. So that sort of thing. But, I was a little bit late and, I feel a little bit fraudulent almost, you having me on when there are so many great dog drivers here in the UK and beyond who were there during the golden era, which I sadly missed. I didn't go down south until 1975. And missed the golden era, but nonetheless, I love the dogs. And no sooner had I done my 2.5 years, and I went up 4 days after getting home, was asked to go up to the Arctic as a boat skipper, and later sledged with dogs up there, and in quite extensively in Norway, where I trained sledge dogs for a 1.5 years.
Mm. So very much, I mean, I think from what you're saying is, I think on the shoulders of giants, isn't it? I think that's one of the
Yes,
wonderful things about Antarctica
yes,
is it's this kind of unbroken lineage, isn't there, of people
yes.
and the amazing accomplishments. So with that in mind, let's go back in time. I mean, dogs were there in the very first expedition to Antarctica, of course, with Borchgrevink, and then later with Scott in the heroic era. Can you tell me a bit about those early days of dogs and their use in the Antarctic, in that early days of exploration?
Yeah, the Southern Cross expedition, Borchgrevink, who led the Southern Cross expedition, 1899 to 1900, is often sort of overshadowed by Scott, Amundsen, Shackleton, and it was an extraordinary expedition, and the first to set foot on Greater Antarctica and to first people to overnight on Antarctica, and Savo and Must, the two Lappish dog drivers who took the dogs, Siberian huskies that they used, ashore, and so it was the first time dogs were on the continent, the first night spent on the Antarctic continent. And they made not a long journey, but they did make a journey. I think they got down to something like 78 degrees 50 minutes south on the Ross Ice Shelf. So it really was, it really was the sort of cutting of the teeth of Antarctic travel.
Yeah, yeah. And then sort of fast forward, sort of 10 years or so to those early days of the race to the pole. I mean, they played a crucial role in that
Yes,
race, I suppose. And
they
Scott
did.
famously didn't have dogs, and Amundsen did. Can you tell me a bit about kind of what that was all about, and then what happened next?
Well, I think, the poor old Scott gets so much bad press, and there was an awful book written during the 70s that really was criminal, for want of a better word, because Scott was a great man, but there wasn't the communication in those days, and they didn't know a lot about dog travel. They took dogs, but didn't know quite how to use them. Where Amundsen was a consummate professional, he really did cut his teeth wintering up on the Northwest Passage expedition, learned how to travel, and very athletic. Set off with 52 dogs and returned with 11, feeding dog to dog, as most people know. He was extraordinary. But poor Scott, of the two, Scott's the one who's left a real useful legacy, for want of a better way of describing it. If I always think of Captain Scott being the father of Antarctic science, and Nansen being the father of Arctic science. So, Scott really does leave the legacy, but there's no doubt about it. Amundsen was the professional. Yeah.
Yes, yeah, indeed.
Mhm.
And I think so during that time and later, the kind of the use of dogs and the kind of the optimization, I suppose, of the use of dogs in the polar regions really changed, didn't it? With Nansen and later on Gino Watkins. So it's some
Yeah,
interesting.
I really Nansen and Gina Watkins really paved the way in many ways for the way we operate in the Antarctic today.
Mm,
Nansen, he invented the famous sledge, which of course we still use. Beautiful thing made out of ash, sometimes with hickory runners, 12-foot, all held together with lashings, and you can take a little pot of cellulose with you and some whipping twine, and you can repair the sledge wherever you might be.
mm,
You can take your gloves off and touch it, and your fingers don't get frozen to the wood as metal or other material might. And then he also was really the first to utilize skis in polar regions. And skis really only became popular in about the 1840s in Norway. And the Amundsen was very clever to take on Bjaaland, who was a great skier. So he, again, Nansen sort of advocated the ski, and Amundsen took it off to great effect later on. But
mm,
Nansen also used the Primus stove, which we still do too, paraffin stove. And then Gina Watkins, who was in Greenland in the 1930s, he adopted Nansen's ways, but he really came up with the sort of Fid Bass way of doing things, which was, on base, you had gash days and base duties, egalitarian. It was, nobody stood above the rest. They used the center trace, they used the inside man and outside man. And then, of course, Gina Watkins sadly was killed in Greenland in 1932. But in the British Grahamland expedition in 1934 went with remnants of BGLE, one of them being Bingham, who took the dog driving skills from Greenland to BGLE, and then, of course, later to FIDS. So that whole system of gash days and inside man and outside man really was spawned in Greenland.
It's fascinating, isn't it, how that it's got, I say technology and kind of in quote marks really, but it's kind of how that the techniques and things evolved, and the use of different equipment and things that really paved the way, I think, for kind of the 20th century scientific era with Operation Tabarin. But just before we sort of jump into that, I mean, when you read about the heroic era and the use of dogs, I mean, there was these dogs and horses and even motor cars at one time. Do you find those stories resonate with your experiences? Do you find echoes from the 50, 70 years before when you were running dogs yourself?
Yeah, I think those of us who were with Bass down south in the Antarctic during that period between the Second World War and the Falkland War, things did change, but not at a fast pace. And the biggest change, of course, was the switch towards the end of that period from dog to snow scooter or skidoo. Yeah. But other than that, it wasn't too different. When you looked at the clothing, for instance, that Scott and Amundsen wore, they wore Burberry jackets, which was not very unlike the Ventile Egyptian cotton anorak that we wore. We early on wore pajamas as thermals, and then later on thermal. We wore woolly hats and leather gloves, more or less as they did. They had finnesko, and we had originally canvas mucklucks, but later they became a synthetic, it was all ex-Korean War. Yeah. So it was, there was some sort of similarities really. And that lovely thing, all the natural fibers from silk through to cotton to wool and everything, still the best. And largely things were made out of those materials. But I think the big thing, and I say this to this day, and I was base commander for something like 35 years, and that was south and north up in the Arctic. But the one thing that hasn't changed, I think, since we first stepped foot in Antarctica is sort of compatibility. And that was always I think the toughest thing for people to cope with, and is to this day, just groups of people living cheek by jowl for long periods of time. And if anybody comes away from a polar trip feeling a bit worse for wear, it's probably because they didn't get on and with their fellow members of the trip. And that makes polar work quite tough. And I think that's unchanged from the heroic era.
Absolutely. And I think even today, you talk to us and even our own operations when we run teams, conservation teams and the Port Lockery team, it's so important to get people that can I say, rub along cheek by jowl successfully. And absolutely. So what we want to get to, I think, is kind of the meat of this, is your experiences with the dogs. I mean, you were a dog trainer and you're a dog driver, and they played a big part of your life in the Antarctic, didn't they? So what role did dogs play? I mean, why were dogs there? So post Operation Tabarin, so getting into the second half of the 20th century, why were they there?
Well, I think really from the 1940s right through to the early 70s. I mean, that was the sole way of getting from A to B, and I could reel off name after name of these splendid, amazing men who did these colossal journeys. From Stonington, from Horseshoe, from Hope Bay, from Adelaide, just extraordinary. And it must be said, it was magnificent what the dogs did, but the energy and enthusiasm of those men during that period to drive those dogs those distances was just incredible. Yeah. And you've only just got to try it, waking up in the morning in a frozen tent with 2 hours ahead of you digging out. And then maybe on a good day up to sort of 25 to 30 miles sledging, running. And then your 2 hours of digging in, and then you start on your 9 biscuits and your meat bar and your bar of chocolate or whatever you're going to have in the evening. They did that, these colossal journeys,
Yes.
and ran with the dogs. I think that's, just extraordinary what they accomplished.
Absolutely. I mean, do you think actually with the men working with the dogs together, do you think that was why they were such great accomplishments? It was a kind of a symbiosis which kind of urged both on. Do you think there was something in that about
between man and dog?
Yeah.
Yes, I'm sure there is. I think we see it today. People with their pet dog, there's something, and I think particularly a working animal, whether it's in the days of horse-drawn vehicles, people had a sort of love and affinity with their draft animal, and there's nothing like depending on each other to to conjure up a really special relationship.
Yes.
It's very, very special. Well, it's quite marked actually, just having driven dogs with people in the Antarctic, but also a lot of people up in the Arctic and in Norway, is you can usually tell the dog drivers who have lived with dogs during childhood and so on, have a real sort of understanding of the dogs, and those who've really just sort of been introduced to a dog team. It's quite subtle, but it's there are sort of people who are good with animals and those that not quite so.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I think it sounds like the relationship. I mean, when you read accounts, diaries, letters, and written accounts of Antarctic travel with dogs, you do get a strong sense of that affection and kind of mutual dependency between man and dog. But it takes a lot of training. However, I mean, I think training teams and training individual dogs was a big part of your life, I think, and building those relationships with dogs. Tell me a bit about. I think there's Giles was one of your
Giles is the lead dog.
Tell me a bit about
it's a funny old relationship with the Greenland dog. I mean, the Greenland dog is just so closely related to the wolf. I think there's something like 800 years. They've studied the dogs in North Greenland, the Greenland dogs today, because they're very, very careful not to get any interbreeding into the Greenland dogs up there. And I think there's something, it's almost unchanged, the sort of genetics of those dogs for about 800 years or something. It's just extraordinary. Whereas, all other dogs have been interbred and so on, as have a lot of Greenland dogs, sort of in that aren't up in North Greenland. But you do have to really respect that wolf culture, for want of a better word. They're only slightly different to the wolf. Then they differ in the bitches come into oestrus twice a year, whereas the wolf bitch comes in once a year. But their pecking order, whereby they have the sort of king dog, the one who's really in charge of the pack or the team in our case. And then you have that's a picture there of Martin, who was my king dog in the players, and he was an absolute brute and would tear into anybody who happened to get in his way. You've got to have a king dog, and then there's a pecking order all the way down the social structure to some poor gibbering idiot at the bottom of the pile with sort of permanent diarrhea who's being got at by everybody. But every now and again they want to, perhaps, Suka wants to take on Athos or something just to go one peg up the social order, and you'll have a fight on your hands. And they've always done this and always will. And the best dog drivers in the world won't stop them doing that. And my opinion always was, you shouldn't stop them doing that. That sort of aggression is what makes them stay out in the cold all that time and pull sledges and so on. The other big difference between them and the wolf is that Greenland dogs do like to pull sledges, whereas wolves that have been put in teams are actually quite lazy. But
it's a well-kept secret. So it sounds like life would get pretty raucous, I suppose. I mean, if you've got these dogs who are kind of behaving, as packs and establishing their pecking orders, that kind of fights breaking out. I mean, how unruly could it get, and how did you cope with that?
You can never tell quite when it's going. I mean, this picture here, lovely day, tails are high, they're all very happy, they're really enjoying it, the weather's good. Twiggy, front left, he's got half a tail because he lost it in a fight, but he was a lovely back pair, the sort of two big bruisers that get the sledge going in the morning, just heave it up and get it going, and then you go all the way up to the front there, and then you've got the lead dog, which we choose. And I trained up a new lead dog. He was called Giles. There's me and Giles there. And that was interesting in itself, taking a dog from scratch. His sister was a lead dog as well, Yvonne. They both came from Martin and Stella, who was the bitch that they came from. And but I used to go out each day on the sea ice in South Bay at Rothera and run him round on a 25-foot rope, exaggerating the turns for left and oak for right, and getting him to stop and sit, and then try and pull him towards me on a rope. And of course, initially he'd do that. He'd come to me, but I got him to learn that he had to stay put, always stay out at front, so that if anything happened to the team, he wouldn't concertina it and come back towards the sledge. Or if dogs fell down a crevasse, for instance, which happened a couple of times with me, he would anchor the front and I'd anchor the back, and you'd pull the dogs out. But so that relationship, you and the lead dog, was a very, very, very close one. But as I say, you know, a fight could just happen at any time, and it made your heart sort of pound its way out of your chest when it first happened, and you never really get used to it. It's just horrible. It's very noisy, and there's bits of fur, and of course the blood shows rather well on the snow. And you're wading into this lot of knitting of rope and traces and dogs screaming and belting it. A lot of it is actually a lot of growl and not much teeth. And you can get a lot of them out just by picking up the back legs and taking them out by like a wheelbarrow. If you lift the back legs off, they let go with their teeth, and you could take them out. And then you get down to the real offenders, and there's one screaming and the other one's sort of tearing a bit out or locked on. And there you might have to use a soft thumper just to give them a belt, or sometimes the back end of a ski and put that in between their molars and then just twist it slightly, and the torque on the ski would just open the jaw enough and you'd get them apart, and they'd be dripping blood and all looking very pleased with themselves and very happy. Had a good fight.
Yeah, you're a braver man than I. So did you have vets on hand to
Well, we
these sort of
didn't. I
situations?
had seen vets, famous vets, Bosman and Taylor and Orr and others who'd spent time south. We didn't have a vet with us at that time. What we did have, we had a medical guide for us, which was Curafid, and then a medical guide for dogs, which was Cura Hound, and so that had details in there. And then in the vet bag, the two most used drugs were butazolidine, which we gave when a dog was getting arthritic. And if you're out on a trip, tended to give the dog some butazolidine just to keep it going till you got back to base. And then sadly, you'd have to shoot the dog. And on one case, I actually had to shoot, actually it was Twiggy, actually. I had to shoot him out on a journey because he was just so bad. The arthritis really got the better of it. Tended to be 8-year-olds when that happened. But the other drug rather was acetylpromazine, which we gave by injection, and that was we gave that to sedate the dog before stitching them up after a fight. And you'd get the syringe ready. I can't remember how many mil it was, something like 10 or 20 mil of acetylpromazine in the syringe, and then you'd put the syringe, loaded syringe and needle, in your thermos flask, which you used for your lunch break. And you put in there, put the top on so it didn't freeze when you were outside, and get out the tent and find this poor unfortunate dog and whap this stuff into the back leg somewhere, and then wait half an hour or so, and the poor old dog would be quite sort of dozy by that time. And you pull them into the tent, and one person would sit over the dog and pin it down, and I'd put these sort of whacking great big blanket stitches into the poor thing to pull all the bits together. And then they lost their ability to stay warm, having had acetylpromazine. So we kept them in the tent overnight, and this dog would settle down, and we'd settle down in the sleeping bag with a billy can of ice ready for the morning, and candle and all this sort of thing on the box between the two of us in the tent. But more often than not, you'd be woken in the night by a dog that was just wide awake and very happy to be in the tent. The dog charging around the tent and beating you up. And it was very funny. It was lovely. Yeah.
Chaos.
Yes, yes.
And I believe they had good singing voices, these dogs.
Yeah, they do. And again, the old the wolf thing, and the wolf song is just, or sledge dog song is just so beautiful on base. I mean, we had nothing like the numbers they did have in the golden era of dogging down the Antarctic, but we had 40 at Rothera. And quite often in the evening, one would start crooning away and singing, and then others would come in, and eventually all 40 of them would be singing, all with a different pitch and different note, and beautiful, beautiful song. What we couldn't work out is how they knew when to stop, because they would sing, 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 and then like that, they would all stop exactly the same time, even as, you know, as though they got a conductor who was telling them. It was just extraordinary how they stopped. But when we were sledging, if the dogs were in a blow, but a lot of windy weather, if the dogs outside were getting snowed under, we should have really gone out to dig them out, you know, particularly in case they suffocated. But we did sometimes when we were a bit snug and warm in our sleeping bags, and you could hear this howling gale and buffeting the tent and so on. We used to cheat sometimes and just sit up in our sleeping bags and go, "Hoo, hoo," like this, and they would respond. They'd call back to us, and then the next thing we knew, they were all singing, and we knew when they were singing that they were also standing up. So it was a bit unfair on them, really, but at least they got them out of the deep snow.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I mean, there were a lot of dogs over the, I think, a 50-year period, wasn't it, when dogs were being used by FIDS and then British Antarctic Survey. But of course, they weren't, all those dogs were not all imported. They were bred in Antarctica, weren't they? These are kind of born and bred. I mean, were you involved in breeding of the sledge dogs? Yes,
during my time down there, Tony Escott and I, we looked after we were the sort of pup men, and that was nice. There was a dog chart which we used to get out and lay on the table with a weight on each end, a very, very long chart. And I think it had, I'm not absolutely certain of this, but I think it had, you know, the dogs going back to more or less to 1945, and with pencil lines between them connecting dog and bitch who had bred. And what you'd look for, there were, I think, over the history of Bath and FIDS, there were, I think, 13 generations of sledge dogs.
Wow.
And over that time, you would look for, ideally, a gap of 3 generations between dog and bitch, so that they hadn't been interconnected in any way for 3 generations. And then you'd put them together and on the mating spans, and then produce some puppy dogs. And in the dog room at Rothera, the tins of milk, which we supplemented the bitch's milk with later on when the pups were getting a bit bigger, they were all marked base Y, so it was all horseshoe milk that had come from the big cans of dried powder. And then we would also cut later on, we'd cut chunks of fillet seal meat. But one of the problems was that the seal meat in the pans in the dog room, and Tony and I used to look for places to thaw the meat out, and we got into terrible trouble because it did stink rather, this meat, when it started to thaw out old seal meat. So we used to hide them in various rooms around the station, the generator shed. We got caught out there, and we were always getting into trouble. A big sort of arg pan full of chunks of meat. But one time I can't remember if it was me or Tony, but we hid one in the meltwater room where the tank was, where the snow melt was. And somebody found this smelly tin and threw it out the door. And we had a gale for a few days, and the pan of meat disappeared underneath a snowdrift. And when the weather improved, somebody went out and cut blocks of snow to put in the tank. And a block that was about a 2-foot cube, 2 foot by 2 foot by 2 foot, and managed to get this pan of seal meat in the middle of the cube and threw it in the tank. And we were brushing our teeth and whatever, drinking tea, and we're thinking, this tastes a bit strange, you know, really weird. And eventually the whole base turned out, and and Tony and I had forgotten about this pan of meat, and we drained the tank and found this very furry and very smelly pan of seal meat lying in the bottom. We weren't popular.
No,
we weren't.
Banned from the kitchen.
Yes, absolutely.
Indeed. So those countries that you talked about, the big family tree, if you like, of all the dogs, the Antarctic dogs. But actually, a bit of selective breeding went on. Did you pick dogs with the characteristics that you really wanted to, you know?
They did in the past, I think. We were getting a bit short on breeding dogs latterly. It was getting tougher and tougher to, actually match. I can remember we put together, who was it? Suka and Miriam, and they didn't perform. So we had to go for a second best, which was Boot and Miriam, and we got a litter, but they weren't an ideal match. They actually produced some good pups, actually, and they worked well. That was Growler and Brash and Flo and Strugi. And they turned into very good. Actually, Growler didn't survive, actually, but the other three, they turned into good sledge dogs.
Yeah.
But we couldn't be as choosy as they could be in the past.
Mm-hmm. And there's some great records, I think, that were kept. I think we've got some examples of dog cards. Can you just tell us a bit about those? How these?
Dog cards were useful, particularly for a new arrival on base, and you were taking up a team. And we quite often, the teams would be shuffled around a bit at the end of one person's stay in the Antarctic, just so that some dogs were getting old, just trying to even up the teams. We had 4 teams when I was at Rotherham, and just to shuffle them a bit so that each team was as strong as the other. So a new dog driver had to put in a bit of work just to settle in a new team. And in my case, actually, to train up a new lead dog as well. But the dog cards were great because it gave a sort of medical record, and it gave you a little bit of an idea of character and odd traits. This dog will cock its leg on its next door neighbor. This one will doesn't like so and so, keep him clear of a different dog, doesn't like baggy or something. But it's quite useful just to sort of learn a little bit about them before you got to know them intimately yourself.
Yeah, and actually now they're really lovely records to look at.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we've got a couple of other examples. Just tell you a bit about the little mugshot, and then who the parentage and which base they're at, but also their characteristics.
Wonderful system.
Great system, and just a wonderful resource now. And really, really fascinating. Now we just saw a glimpse there of Steve the dog, who's a kind of legendary character in Fid's lore, isn't he? Can you tell us Steve's story?
Yeah, it's a lovely story, isn't it? Where was it? 1958 at Detail. Angus Erskine, I don't know if you've heard of him. He was at Detail and produced a wonderful film, actually, of dog sledging. It's worth looking out. It's marvelous, black and white film of dog sledging at Detail. So anyway, they were at Detail Island Hut, at the station there, or base there. And the Bisca was trying to get to them to relieve the station and couldn't get. It was just the ice was too heavy. So they badly needed equipment and food and so on. It was actually crucial. They didn't have another year's worth. So they had to get this equipment and food from the Bisco. So they sledged, I think it was something like 30 miles over sea ice to get to the Bisco, and got the stores. But just when they had arrived at the John Bisco, Steve, the sledge dog, managed to, I don't know how he slipped his harness or one of the swivels iced up, I don't know. But anyway, he escaped, and off he went, and headed north and went back up to Detail, and they had to just give him up as lost. The ship couldn't get through the ice anyway. And so they'd lost the dog. And everybody was very sad about the loss of Steve the dog. But then, lo and behold, 3 months later, Steve turned up at Horseshoe Island Base Y. And Steve the dog had travelled his own initiative, found his way, navigated 60 miles over the Arrowsmith Peninsula, not an easy journey, and turned up at Horseshoe. And they reckoned he returned to Detail, ate his way through part of the seal pile there, and was missing his friends and so on, and decided to head off and head south. But an extraordinary story.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And it's returned as fit as he was when he left. Remarkable. And he'd only ever done that journey once, I believe.
Yes, he'd done it previous summer. Apparently, he'd sledged down to Horseshoe.
Yeah.
So again, isn't it extraordinary? But I think, those of us with pet dogs, if you take them out in wherever it might be, on the Fell Mountain Park, wherever, and you can take them there 2 or 3 years later, and they'll know where they've smelt a rabbit or something of interest.
Yeah.
they're extraordinary. Their way of recording and withholding information.
No,
Yeah,
absolutely. They're
yeah,
remarkable, absolutely remarkable.
marvelous.
But he's a true legend, is Steve. And I think the
Yes,
fact that it's Steve is even better. It's
yeah,
fantastic.
yeah.
So, I mean, before you sort of fast forward to the 1990s, I just have you got a kind of a favourite kind of story about your sledging and dog experience?
Mm.
What's your
I mean, so many. I think, and it's still today, I would say, that the Antarctic bases have changed. They've become much bigger and all these sorts of things. We've got communication. And the big outdoors is the same as it ever was. So it doesn't matter what year, hopefully in another 100 years' time, people going to the Antarctic will just still be bowled over. The big outdoors will just be the same as it ever was. But so, all that just being in total awe of this extraordinary place. But as far as the dog's concerned, there are so many just lovely stories, that relationship that you have with them. The ones that like you to go in the evening and put your arm around them and cuddle them. And then those that preferred you to sit about a yard away or a meter away and just chat to them from there. They don't always want to be touched. And you have to sort of learn these things. But I think really for me, a sort of golden moment for me was having trained Giles up and got him to learn the commands and so on. And then taking him out in front of 2 dogs, and then in front of 4 dogs, and then eventually in front of 8 dogs. And then setting out and him setting off with confidence and obeying the commands. Not always. Every lead dog will.
dog after all.
Zigzag days when you're going all over the place. But then you'd be among crevasses or something, and his ears would prick up and go rather close in the middle of his head, sticking up these 2 ears and really listening. And he knew when I was nervous, and just, you could go a bit and he'd come round a sort of a degree or less, and then you out of it and he'd come round again just slightly. And then the next day in bright sunshine, and he would do an extra 2 miles in that day because he was zigzagging all over the place, just not doing it just terribly well. But I think that day setting out when he really showed he'd got it was a golden, one of the biggest moments for me, certainly. Yeah.
Really proud moment, I can imagine.
He's just such a great dog.
Yeah. Amazing. So we get to the 1990s and things changed. I mean, I think it was the mechanization, I suppose, of Antarctic travel. But tell us a bit about why things changed for dog sledging in the Antarctic in the 90s.
Well, I mean, it was inevitable in many ways. Snow scooters or skidoos, whatever you want to call them, motor toboggans, they developed. When first went south, and there's so many people, hundreds of people out there will tell the same story. They were incredibly unreliable. You had to pull like mad on this pull cord to get the blasted thing to work, and then you got on, and your right boot melted on you got this smell of burning rubber as your boot slowly melted on a bit of exhaust, and all these things. And in fact, at one time, I can remember packing up snow scooter engines to go in a box, so people would actually carry a spare engine with them. And then there were times when people would take the carburetor into the tent with them just to bolt it back on again in the morning. And I mean, they were fearful thing. Whereas now, they got heated handlebars and ignition switch and a heated seat and all these sort of characters. So I mean, it was inevitable that they were going to come, fast. You could be traveling in Grahamland. The average for preparing a journey, the average is, I think, generally recognized at 8 miles a day average. On the Ross Sea side, it's 12 miles a day, but on Grahamland, something like 8 miles a day. And the dog team, you could go in a whiteout and go very carefully forward, and the skidoo men would be stuck in their tents waiting for the contrast to improve so you could see, because you're out front, the first one to fall down a hole. But then you could be out traveling, sort of going, yeah, we're doing better than you 3 days or 4 days ahead. And then one good day, and a skidoo would do 100 miles or more. So it was inevitable it was going to happen. But what I think a trick was missed was not just to have kept 2 teams on the bases. They're marvelous for morale. And I think what's often missed as well, they're great for field training and for new people, mountaineers. Doesn't matter how long their Himalayan or Alpine CV is to actually go out with a dog team, very, slow travel, learning about snow structure and crevassing and weather, and just generally getting to know the Antarctic at snail pace is the best training you can give anybody. So I do think it's a shame that they weren't just held on for that purpose in itself. But anyway, the powers that be decreed they had to go, which is awfully sad.
Yes, and I suppose it was the environmental protocol, wasn't it, that really triggered this, and this is kind of removal of non-native species, and a dog, of course, being a dog being a non-native species, and had to go. But I think it's with great sadness, wasn't it? That
well, then we're not indigenous to Antarctica either, so I do think it's a bit unfair. But anyway, they had to go.
Tell us about this picture. This is a great one.
Well, this is Shrapnel. This is a dog called Shrapnel, who wasn't in the players. He wasn't in my team. But there's Shrapnel, and he's peeing on a post. And it's the only time I've ever stolen. I'll probably get arrested after doing this webinar. It's the only thing I've ever stolen in my whole life. And it was a party in London the night before joining the ship in Southampton to sail down to the Antarctic, and for my third winter. And seeing somebody off outside, looked up, and there was a sign which said, dogs, London Borough of Hammersmith. Any person who allows their dog to foul the footpath is liable to prosecution. And I'm afraid I stole it and put it on the sign. But the dogs loved it because they don't have many things to pee on. And it made a nice photo.
Yes, better than the tent, I would have thought. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, I have a last question for you before we go to audience questions. But I think I've read somewhere that you said you've been a soft touch when it comes to the dogs. But do you have any advice for anyone at home with a naughty or misbehaving dog? I think you've got dogs yourself. Is that right?
Yeah, I have. Yeah, I was a bit of soft touch with dogs. I think learned that blowing a raspberry up a dog's nose, or for a Greenland dog to pick them up so all the feet are off the ground and then spin them around, and that was actually punishment enough very often, and they'd look at you in a very different way once you'd lifted them off the ground. But I was a bit of a soft touch really. But no, I think if you met we've got 2 black Labradors here. We've had Labradors for years, and actually used to make harnesses for them, and the children used to go off. We used to take them off with at great speed, it must be said, being pulled by the dogs on sledges. But I always think dogs, the big trick, particularly domestic dogs. Konrad Lorenz, a German zoologist, wrote a splendid book called Man Meets Dog. And in that, he says that really all dogs are basically babies or friends, except for the Greenland dog. And the Greenland dog, at best, is a colleague. It's just a working relationship, really.
Yeah.
But going back to the sort of the domestic, the pet dog, the only thing, and I know in our household, it's consistency is the problem. So, and I think it goes for a lot of households, where you've got to be firm. You don't want your dog to jump up. You're trying to make them as socially acceptable as possible, and you don't want them to jump up, and you don't want them to pee on your neighbour's plant pots, and all these things that we try to discourage them from doing. But then the next member of the household will decide, that rule doesn't really matter. So I think quite often dogs are a bit confused because they don't get the same message in one household, and that certainly happens in ours. But we love them. We love them nonetheless.
Oh, absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you. Right, I'm going to open it to the floor. I've noticed in the chat actually that there's a few former colleagues, perhaps, of yours.
They're going to rib me, no doubt. Quite right. Quite right.
Lots of tough questions, but let's take some audience questions. Here we go. Sue's asking, who chose the names of the dogs? They seem very random. They do, don't they?
Yes. I mean, a lot of smoko, which was tea time or coffee break, known as smoko. That was really where the dog names came, and a huge amount of friendly argument, and we'd come up with names. But a lot of fun, and looking at the dog chart, it's fabulous just to see the good names, including Steve, of course, over the years.
From the sublime to the ridiculous.
Athos, Porthos, and Aramis, which I would thought were very fine names.
Oh, marvellous, yes. Thank you. Did any dogs ever turn on people? Oh, yes, mid-fight.
No, very rare. Very, very rare. Funny enough, actually, My lead dog Giles could be a little bit aggressive, and he did got somebody in the forearm, and he had to resort to hitting Giles over the head with a bucket over and over the time to get him to leave go. And he could be, but then if you knew his father Martin, who was the king dog, he really was a bit of a brute. So yeah, that was. And I got bitten quite a lot, but I trained sledge dogs for a year and a half in Norway, and for an expedition that it's another story that we were going to do in the Antarctic, but didn't actually quite work out, not the way that we wanted it to anyway. And I got bitten quite a lot, but that was normally splitting dogs up. We built 7 dog pens, and I spent time socializing the dogs loose in dog pens, and it was fascinating, and managed to get them so that they didn't have to be spanned out. They just coexisted. But in the meantime, I used to go to the sick house or the hospital with puncture wounds all over me because I got bitten. But it was always by a mistake. They were usually thinking I was a dog when they lunged their teeth into me.
Yeah. Yes, just getting in the way. Yes.
Just getting in the way. Yes. Yeah.
Great. Beverly's asking, are any dogs spayed or neutered to minimize aggressive behavior, or does that affect their ability to work as a pack?
No, we certainly didn't do that. And I think, again, that sort of drive, I think it whatever the drive is in them, you wouldn't want to sort of in any way affect them in any way. That whole sort of
natural and full of hormones.
Yeah, exactly.
Indeed. Next question. Josh is asking, were there any dogs present at Lockroy or Deception during Operation Tabarin?
Well, they came a bit later. They came a year later, didn't they? They hoped to, the first year of Tabarin, to install the dogs at Hope Bay, but just couldn't get in there. So they went in a year later. Yeah. 25 dogs, I think it was, that went in 1944 rather than 1943, which was the plan. Yeah.
Yeah, so Lockroy is never a sledging base, was it? But they tend to be further south. But,
yeah. And they did some great journeys. They did the 2 sort of big journeys down the East Coast, down the Prince Gustav Channel, down to Cape Longing. So Taylor and co did some magnificent journeys with the dogs. Yeah.
Yeah, from Deception. Yeah, and Hope Bay. Great. Yeah, interesting. Josh Blood's asking, other than the dogs, the pig at Fort Lockroy, I believe, and Scott's ponies, were there any other animals brought to Antarctica? Do you know?
Now, others who would be probably better at this, but I think they had cats on some of the bases. And I think there might have been the odd budgerigar or parrot even, before these rules and laws came into being. We didn't have anything with us at that time, but I think certainly cats, and I think some cage birds made their way south.
I've not seen pictures of birds, but certainly I remember images of Dizzy the cat at Port Lockroy, I think in the 50s. So yes,
yeah.
I think yes, used to be entertained by the sheathbills, I think. Next question, please. Question from Val. How long would each dog be expected to work in Antarctica?
Well, we wouldn't ideally wouldn't run the dogs until they were, or the puppies, wouldn't run them until they were a year and a half old. And a bit like human beings, I think it's the clavicle here that's the last bone to grow when we're sort of early 20s, I think. And again, for the sledge dogs, you wanted to be sure that their bones were really firm and hardened up before you put them in a sledge. So we would run them from about a year and a half, and then sadly have to shoot them when they were 8 years old. But by that time, their teeth were pretty square. They'd got a 5-pound block of seal meat every other day. And that took them the 2 days really to chew their way through this iron hard block of thing. And the other thing is they got arthritis with pulling. But again, the whole pack social structure was quite interesting. When a dog started to get arthritic or just wasn't eating enough and that sort of thing, you could almost see them leaving the pack. You could almost sense that they sort of knew that their working days were over. Terribly sad. But that's the way of a wolf, that's the way of a sledge dog, and that was the sort of end of their working career and end of their life. At about 8.
But I believe the last dogs, they were taken out, weren't they? Were they taken to Canada? Is that right?
Yes, they were, and I think they had the poor things had. I think 14 were taken out in 1994, and sadly, I think suffered from viruses and so on. Quite a tough thing for them to take on. But what else could you do? I mean, it was worth a try.
Yes.
Worth a try.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I suppose that's an interesting thing, isn't it? That they were, those that were born and bred in Antarctica hadn't been exposed to, as I say, viruses and bacteria that you find in.
And I mean, we suffered it when we came home after a 2.5-year stint. You got every cold and I got beyond Holmes disease, and I don't know what else. We seemed to just catch everything that was going after being isolated down there for 2.5 years. Yeah. But the Sirius Patrol, who did big sledge journeys in East Greenland, they run their pups really quite early, or certainly they did. I drove dogs with some Sirius Patrol members in Norway, but they ran their dogs very early, and then sadly had to shoot them when they were about I think 5 or 6, which is prime. I mean, a 5-year-old dog is just what you're looking for. They're wise and very fit and all these things. So I think the Bath way was right. Wait for 1.5 years and then drive them.
Yeah, let their physiques mature. Yeah, makes sense. Yeah. Next question, please. Question for Judith: are the dogs very intelligent and trainable? For instance, like sheepdogs. So are they? Oh yeah, are they?
Yeah, yes, a bit like a sheepdog, but not quite. I mean, a sheepdog, it's more. I mean, it's playing on that hunting instinct. I mean, I'm here in Cumbria and surrounded by sheep and sheepdogs, farms around me here. And the sheepdog, of course. I mean, you're basically utilizing that hunting instinct, which makes them go in, kabai or away, to go in and even nip at the sheep and round them up. And it's a sort of hunting instinct, and they are very, very bright. The Greenland dogs are a little bit different. It's they love to pull, and you can take a 10-week out puppy on a little piece of string and just walk along with it, and it'll be pulling. It'll want to pull. But to find a lead dog and train them up isn't actually quite so easy. So I'm probably not answering this very clearly, but I think overall they're not as sharp and as easy to train as a sheepdog. Certainly, to get a Greenlander to do what you want is a lot of hard work. Yeah.
So the trick, from what you're saying, it sounds like the trick is to find the one dog that has got the characteristics that are trainable, and that dog will lead the pack. And
absolutely, more often that was a bitch. More often than not, their bitches make much more intelligent and biddable leaders.
I'm saying nothing.
But with it's I was a bit unusual having a male leader, and but the bitches, they really do shine. They're the best.
Interesting. Okay. Next question, please. How did you prevent the dogs mating to prevent inbreeding?
Oh, well, that could be a problem, and that's what very interesting reading about. The big journeys in the early days when they were out on for long periods, and and they did produce pups while out on journeys and so on. And we were doing relatively short trips, tended to be winter trips, and so on. So we could manage it a little bit easier. So basically, if a bitch came into season, then we had a bitch pen, a sort of quite big cage, and put the bitch in there. But one of the troubles was all these suitors would slip their collars or just basically rip whatever to get away, and the night watchman, we always had a night watch. You did a week at a time on night watch. We'd have to go out with a torch to find and capture some dog who was trying to get into the bitch pen. And sometimes you'd wake up in the morning and the night watchman had brought, if it happened to be one of your sledge dogs that was loose, the night watchman had been running around in the night with a torch, would capture it and then just tie it to the end of your bed, and you'd wake up in the morning and there'd be this dog staring at you from a few inches away. Just wondering.
It's amorous intense thwarted.
Yes. What's going on? Yeah.
Fantastic. A question here from John. Nick, differences between seal meat and nurtican?
Oh,
So
that's
this
a,
is-
that's a good question. Yeah. Well, seal meat, sadly, we had to shoot seal. And, you think of a Weddell seal or a crab-eater seal, they're weighing up something like 900 pounds, what's that, so 450 kilo or so. We had to shoot them, but then it's no different really to buying a tin of dog meat. The meat's got to come from somewhere, but we had to go and get it ourselves. And crab-eater seals, I think I'm right in saying, a biologist will tell me I'm talking nonsense, but I think crab-eater seals account for half the seal population of the whole world. So we didn't put a big dent in the seal population, taking some for the dogs. So we'd feed the dog, and that's good high calorie, the seal meat, and particularly the blubber. You wouldn't give the blubber and the skin in the summer. We'd keep that just for winter food. So they in the winter they'd have the meat plus the blubber and the skin, and it was high calorie. I can't quite remember what. I think a 5-pound block worked out at something like 4,000 calories or something like that, or maybe it was more. But so that was just your natural raw meat. Nutrican was a pemmican that had been developed over many years, and again, the vets Orr and Bosselman and others had been involved in getting a block of pemmican that you could take into the field on a sledge. And one of the problems with sledging in Arctic or Antarctic regions, going into the inland ice, is having everything is compact enough that you can, get it all on the sledge. So the Inuit, for instance, they traveled on basically coastline, picking up seal and wood, driftwood. So they'd got their food and so on was available as they went along. Whereas again, this is where Nansen picked up this, was to go into the inland ice, had to think of a way of a compact food. So a compact block of dog food, and then for us in an Andrew Lusk dog food, man food box, it would be a kilo of food per day in 2-liter volume per man in the box. So again, making all this stuff very compact. So the Nutrican, that was a pemmican with a lot of protein in it and a lot of fat in it. But the trick was to actually come up with a recipe which didn't give them diarrhea, and that's really quite difficult. But eventually they came Nutrican, which was really very, very good. And you'd give them on the first day out on a sledge journey. You'd take the wrappers off the pemmican, because you didn't want the paper to get mixed up with any seal meat that might still be in that tummy and cause them to get constipated. So you take the wrapper off, and then you'd feed them 450 gram the first day, and then the second day you could give them with the wrapper on, you'd give them another 450 gram, and then on the third day you give them 900 gram. You give them 2 blocks, and that worked out at, I think, an average of 3,300 calories a day, and they did well on that. But one thing that had never been studied, and I learned later on sledging in the Arctic and in Norway, was to give them water. And there learned that to give the dog a pinch test before you head out, and you'd grab the dog just by the base of the neck and then pull out a bit of skin and fur, and if it stood up like that, you would know it was dehydrated, the dog. And if the fur just settled down like that, you knew it was hydrated. And I often wonder to this day if down south it would have been a lot of hassle. But would it have been worth taking a pint and a quarter rather than 1 pint of paraffin per person per day, and then just making a pan of slush or something just to try and hydrate the dogs? But sadly, never went south again to try that. But they did get a bit dehydrated. Their urine looked like a rather nasty cheap whiskey. But the Nutrican worked well. It worked well.
It's interesting. With the numbers you're sharing, though, they're kind of the same numbers that they're eating the same number of calories really as men would be. You try to get 4,000 calories, and dehydration is a big problem, isn't it? Of course, for humans, so that must be for dogs too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question. Here we go. How did you negotiate flying dog poo?
That's a really good question. setting off in the morning, and I think the best dog drivers in the world would still have this slightly exciting time of setting off in the morning. They just love to pull, and you get out the tent or setting off from base, you go out and harness them up and put each dog onto the trace and try and get them to sit. And of course, they would leap in the air till they sort of catapulted, sprung back on the end of the trace, back onto the ground again. They were just so excited. 9 dogs jerking away and anchors knocked in to try and stop your sledge leaving before you were ready. You had a 20-foot rope with a monkey's fist knot in the end of it, trailing behind the sledge in case you fell off. And then you'd climb on, and you see this chap here. He's got a dongler. That's the waistband there, a rope around his thing, and then he's got a little short back eye-spliced rope that goes over the handlebar. So you'd again hook yourself on so that if you fell off, at least you were hooked on with that, or if you fell down a crevasse, you were pulled out again by that little short bit of rope. But it was always quite exciting leaving in the morning. And then you stood on the brake of the sledge, which was basically a sprung bit of ash underneath the sledge with 2 iron spikes in the end. And you stood on this springy bit of ash and pushed the spikes into the snow. But it didn't achieve a lot, but it slowed you down a little bit. So when you knocked the anchors away and set off, the dogs would scream away at such a speed. And you looked like a powerboat going off a speedboat. There's sort of plumes of snow behind you where because you were sticking a brake in to try and keep the sledge sort of in control. And at the same time, you were shouting to the lead dog to try and get onto a compass course or whatever to go in the right direction at high speed. And then, of course, the dogs, a bit like that first 200 yards in the park, the dogs want to do their business and have a poo. And so you would stand on the brakes while some poor dog would squat and hop along at the same time. And whatever, anyway, this excrement, for want of a better way of putting it, would come out. And the next thing you had to do, again at high speed, was make sure that dog poo didn't get stuck to the bottom of the sledge runner. So you would stand on the side of the sledge, splayed out, trying to edge rather like a pair of skis to get the sledge to slew off to one side. And more often than not, it didn't work. And a bit of dog poo would get stuck to the bottom of the sledge, and it would freeze on like a barnacle on the bottom of a ship or a boat. And you'd lose about a half a knot speed that day because of so you would have to unload the sledge, turn the sledge on its side, scrape off the dog poo, frozen dog poo, so this would be half an hour or more, and then loading the sledge again, and then set off. And lo and behold, you'd only gone about another half a mile, and another dog decided to do it. So that getting away in the morning could be quite a pooey business.
Very hazardous, yes.
Pooey business. Yeah.
Well, what we came for tonight was unvarnished truth, and I think that's exactly what we got there. So thank you very much. Right, I think our hour is up. Nick, it's been absolutely fantastic talking to you. I could listen to this all night. What a wonderful insight into the life you've had with dogs in Antarctica. Wonderful. And thank you very much. And thank you to all those dogs that have made this amazing history. I think, Antarctica is very rich for having had this amazing, chapter, I think, with dogs involved. So thank you to you, Nick.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you, and thank you to everybody, and again, a big cheer for the dogs and those splendid dog drivers of the golden days.
Indeed. So thank you to everybody who's joined us this evening, for joining us and for sharing your questions. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. A wonderful evening. Please let us know what you thought of tonight's event. Leave your comments in the chat or get in touch with us by social media or by email. And don't forget, if you can donate to our Big Give campaign, please do. The link's in the chat. So it's really important work to conserve Blaiklock Hut, and if we can raise that £35,000, it will make sure it'll be protected and preserved for the future. Whatever you can do to support us in our work to protect Antarctic heritage all makes a difference. For now, thank you, everybody. Thank you to the team backstage for making it such a smooth experience, and for everyone for making it such an enjoyable evening. And I look forward to seeing you again next time in the new year. Thank you very much, and good night.